Our next lecturer is Professor Paolo Fonzi, and he will hold a lecture under the title The Fascist Imperialist Policy in the Balkans, the Italian occupation during the Second World War. And the lecture will take about 45 minutes, and it will leave enough space for your questions. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So thank you a lot for the invitation, and sorry for the slight technical problems we had. So because actually my computer doesn't work properly, so we had to borrow one. So sorry for that. And again, thank you a lot for the invitation to this wonderful festival. And sorry for not being able to speak in Bosnian today, but I will deliver my presentation in English, and I welcome in the discussion any questions or comment. So, what you see in the slides is the Italian internment camp for civilian inmates that the Italian army built on the island of Rab in the summer of 1942. To hold captive civilians arrested during counter-insurgency operations. As you can see in the pictures, the Rab camp did not hold only old men, but also many women and children, relatives or partisans or individuals suspected of giving support to the partisan movement. The number of internees varied significantly over time. In October 1942, it reached a peak of 8,000 internees. The Rab camp was not an extermination camp. Nevertheless, the death rate was very high. Overall, according to reliable figures, it amounted to a total of 1,500 individuals who, in most cases, were victims of the dire living conditions in the camp. In the first months after the Italians built the camp in the winter of 1942, the internees were housed in tents. After the war in 1953, on the site where the camp once stood, a memorial was constructed. The memorial was never visited by a representative of the Italian state. Over the last couple of years, Italian activists had started a campaign to have the president of the Italian Republic, or at least a high representative of Italy, visiting the camp memorial as a step towards the creation of a shared memory between Italy and the states occupied by Italy during the Second World War. A memory culture based on the rejection of any form of nationalism or imperialism. This campaign received no response from the Italian institutions. The Rab camp was not the only internment camp for civilians in the occupied territories. The Italians established, in fact, a thick network of camps in the occupied territories. In this map, you can see how dense the network of internment camp was in Albania, Yugoslavia, and Greece. And to this, it should be added also the large number of internment camps in Italy itself, where civilians from the occupied territories were massively interned. None of these sites of internment has become a significant lieu de mémoire of the Italians. The reasons why I decided to introduce this lecture by talking of the Italian camp system is that it is a glaring proof of the absence in Italy of a memory of the most violent and repressive aspects of fascist expansionism during the Second World War. I decided, in other words, to start my presentation from the end, if I may say so, namely from the memory of that the Italians constructed after the war, going then back to the events themselves. So let's start by looking briefly at how the Italians remember the war after, from the decades immediately after the war until today. In 1953, the journal Cinema Nuovo, a left-leaning film magazine, published the draft of a film script written by the film critic Renzo Renzi, entitled L'Armata s'agapò, the Sagapò Army. In Greek, Sagapò means I love you, and the expression Armata s'agapò was used during the war by the Allied propaganda to dub the Italian occupation forces in Greece and on other theaters. Italian soldiers, that was the meaning of the expression, dedicated more efforts to making love, agape with local women than to making war. By publishing this script, Renzo Renzi wanted by no means propagate the still predominating, the self-acquitting narrative of the good Italian. Quite the opposite. He wanted to counter the still predominating militarist culture in the Italian society of that time, showing that, against common view, the Italian soldiers' behavior during the war had been very anti-heroic. Devoid of any sense of duty, the Italian soldiers had, in Renzi's opinion, never really grasped the meaning of the war they were fighting. Although the Italians largely engaged in counterinsurgency and violent reprisals against civilians, a fact that Renzi admitted in his script actually, they had never really, they had never been really permeated by fascist warmongering. The Italian military authorities were not pleased by the content of this article, as you can expect, and they considered it a shameless defamation of the Italian army and the nations. So Renzi and Guido d'Aristarco, the journal director, were prosecuted by an Italian military court. The incident sparked an outrage campaign in the Italian public opinion for the liberation of the two film critics, a campaign that has been the object of many studies and historical accounts. When a couple of years ago I went through the journal Cinema Nuovo, I was surprised to find in the journal many letters sent by former soldiers in response to Renzi's article. In these letters, former soldiers narrated their war experience. The script draft had indeed sparked the attention of many. Reading these letters gave me the sense of a generational coming out. A group of former soldiers who had gone to war in their 20s now struggled to give a voice to a piece of experience the societies they lived in was not prepared to listen to. In my following research, I came several times across memoirs, recollections of this nature, but they were mostly published in minor or local outlets. What this made clear to me was that in the first decades after the war, let's say until the 70s, the Italian society kept the memory of the war of 1940-1943 away from the public discussion, confining it to a rather marginal space, and avoiding publicly discussing and remembering the Italian World War II occupations, and more generally the Italian partaking between 1935 and 1943 in the Axis attempt to reshape the world order along fascist lines. This long oblivion can be seen as a sort of collective repression. If we recall, for example, that in September 1943, Italy had 850,000 soldiers deployed in different territories across the Balkans, southern France, and Corsica. It was not only them who had experienced war and occupation, but also their families who had suffered their absence, mourned the loss of a beloved husband, a father, and a breadwinner, and also profited from the looting of the occupied territories. So where had all this massive experience found its expression? So it can be said that in constructing its collective memory of those events after the war, Italy focused overwhelmingly on the moments in which the Italians had either fought against or fallen prey to German violence when Italy was occupied by Nazi Germany, between 1943 and 1945, thus obliterating the war Italy had fought before. Quite similarly, Italian scholars have started investigating the Italian occupation policy with an incredibly long delay. Until the 60s, the list of books available to a potential reader interested in the subject included only the writing of some of the protagonists, like General Mario Roatta, for example, the former King's Lieutenant in Albania, Francesco Iacomone di San Savino. For obvious reasons, this was a very self-apologetic literature. From the 60s and increasingly in the 70s, things began to change, although very slowly. The historical branch of the Italian general staff started commissioning or publishing studies based on the enormous amount of sources stored at their archives. These sources, however, were at that time still not accessible to independent historians, those not directly appointed by the army itself. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the studies commissioned by the army were based on a very old-fashioned understanding of military history, but also on a very strong self-apologetic view. In the same years, however, independent scholars like Enzo Collotti and Teodoro Sala published the first studies on this subject with a more sound scholarly approach. It was not until the 90s that a significant change took place. At the end of the Cold War and the transformation it produced in the Italian political system resulted in the crisis of previous regimes of memory. A younger generation of historians started to challenge established view on the history of fascism and the Second World War. Sources that, as I've mentioned before, had been largely not accessible to historians for decades were now consulted quite freely. Davide Rodogno studies Il Nuovo Ordine Mediterraneo, the second so they can see in the slide, published in 2003, was the first monograph to address all fascist occupation policies. It was based on a large amount of sources that were being made accessible in those years. Since then, a flurry of studies has appeared, mostly focused on Italian occupation policies in single countries or regions, Italian war crimes and violence against civilians, collaboration and ethnic conflicts, especially in Yugoslavia, the policy by the Italian authorities towards Jews, which in many cases saved them from violence and deportation. Drawing on this consistent amount of literature recently published, in my presentation today I will focus on two aspects of the Italian occupation policies during World War II. So I will first look at Italian fascist imperialism, trying to frame it within the larger phenomenon of the Axis imperialism of the 30s and the 40s. I will then look in more detail at the governance the Italian practice in the occupied territories, trying to single out its peculiarities. Fascist imperialist drive developed along two matrices. The first matrix was Italy's position in the international system and Italy's drive towards the acquisition of areas of direct or indirect influence in the conflict-laden environment that was the war between the foundation of the Italian state in 1861 and the First World War. In this phase, large post-imperial regions created by the crisis of multinational empires open up to the forays of new forms of empire building. Italy's projected areas of influence lied for the most part in what Mark Levin has called the Balkan rimlands. In this territory, by the fin de siècle, it's a quote actually by him. Sorry, so this is the right one. Sorry for the mistake. As you can see in the slide, so it's a quote by Mark Levin that says that in this territory, by the fin de siècle, a core of modern industrialized Western states, through their political, economic, and military muscle, were making of the once very powerful and normative Eastern world empires, within or close to Europe, weaker neighbors. In Waldorfinian terms, this paradigm shift made of the first group a metropolitan core of power, and the latter a semi-periphery. But crucially, with the regions at the outer western or southern edges of that semi-periphery most vulnerable to metropolitan impacts and influences. End of the quote. Within this group of industrialized Western states, Italy had a rather marginal position, a position the Australian historian Richard Bosworth has labeled that of the least of the great power. Italy was not only a latecomer to industrialization and colonialism, but was also a relatively weak one. As again Richard Bosworth has stressed, fascist imperialism was to inherit many of the characteristics of the Italian imperial drive developed in pre-fascist Italy. There is therefore a high degree of continuity between liberal Italy and fascism in this regard, a continuity visible in the fact that many of the expansionist goals pursued by Mussolini had been laid out in the Treaty of London of 1915, where the powers of the Entente had promised Italy large territories in the Mediterranean after the war. At the same time, this was also a sort of unpleasant legacy for fascism. While the goals remain basically the same between liberal Italy and fascism, at least in geographical terms, the desire to remedy Italy's marginality in the international system of the Age of Empires between 1870 and 1914, and more generally within the development of European modernity, was a key component of fascist Italy policy. The second matrix of fascist expansionism was the integration of Italy's imperialism increasingly in the 30s into a larger international discourse aimed at reshaping the world order, which led to the formation of the Axis in 1936, a movement that reached its climax in 1942. Axis imperialism was pivoted on a host of common ideas that not only informed foreign policy, but were at the same time the product of transnational crossovers and mutual perceptions. Recent historiography has stressed the role of these transnational connections in the development of a fascist imperial nexus. For example, the fascist aggression on Ethiopia in 1935 raised a wave of reactions all over the world. In Japan, the public opinion was partly hostile to the aggression, seen as an expression of Western imperialism, but part of the Japanese elite saw in the war a positive challenge to the order established by the Western powers after World War I, quite in line with Japan's expansionism against the international establishment of the time and the League of Nations. The Swiss historian Daniel Hedinger has argued that crises at the peripheries of the crumbling global order were key to the formation of a global fascist imperialist culture. The Balkans were, for Italian fascism, one such area, regarded as a central place where to infuse new life into European dominance over semi-peripheries and peripheries. Ideological metaphors such as vital space, the Lebensraum, became a sort of watermark of the fascist global imperialist culture, and a common language that allowed communication within the fascist global alliance. Opposition to free market liberalism and to a liberalist Weltwirtschaft, world economy, were key constituents of fascist ideologies, as it was the idea of reconstructing the international economic integration along Großraumwirtschaften, greater economic areas. Racist hierarchies were an intrinsic component of the idea of constituting large economic blocs dominated by young nations, as opposed to the representatives of the old world marked by a decaying liberalism and upholding an outdated idea of nation. In reality, only a mask of Western hegemony over weaker states. A specific form of settler colonialism was part and parcel of this drive towards a new world order. The creation of a fascist global culture was both the product and of convergence and of competition. While up to the mid of the 30s, Italy was a model for other national movements, from the mid-30s onwards to the end of the World War, Germany rose to that position of the model. Fascist Italy's imperialism resulted from the intertwining between these two matrices. Many of its features were hardly a novelty. What was new was whether they are merging in a new, highly radicalized synthesis. Some of the peculiarities of Italian fascist imperialism show, however, quite neatly how much its history, the first matrix, weighed on its destiny. As the Great Depression opened up new possibilities for capital penetration in Southeastern Europe, Germany largely won the race to turn that region into an informal empire of Germany. Italy was left already by the mid-30s only with the spoils of that race. Germany could resort to long-standing ties with that region. The existence of large communities of ethnic Germans in Yugoslavia and large business networks developed decades before the war, intensified with the incorporation of Austria in 1938, was key to the German success in penetrating those markets. This notwithstanding, Italy was a moment in Italy, 1941 was a moment of euphoria. After the victory over France and the Balkan campaign of 1940-1941, the realization of the much-coveted European empire, adding to the already conquered colonial space, seemed close at hand. Italian institutions developed plans and schemes for the integration of the empire after the war. In 1939-41, a wide-reaching discussion about the future shape of Italy's Mediterranean empire in some of the leading journals of Italy developed. Yet no comprehensive scheme akin to the German plans for Eastern Europe, for example, was ever developed by any Italian institution. Italian plans remain rather sketchy, and no centralized planning activity took place between 1940 and 1941. Italy's empire building in the Balkans was pivoted on Albania, under informal Italian control since the mid-20s, and eventually occupied by Italy in April 1939. The importance of Albania was mirrored by unofficial propaganda that assigned a particular role to this country in Rome's imperial community. For example, as Gaspare Ambrosini wrote in Rivista Albania in 1940, Rome's imperial community was comprised of three levels: a top layer, occupied by Italy and Albania, the second one, including Libya and the Dodecanese Islands, and the third one with Africa Orientale Italiana. Needless to say, much of this was lip service because Albania was regarded in internal communication as a province of Italy. However, the idea that Albania held a privileged position in the Italian imperial community is mirrored by the fact that in 1941, with the partition of Yugoslavia, Albania annexed part of Yugoslavia inhabited by ethnic Albanians. In addition, in Italy's intentions, Albania was to gain also parts of Macedonia and Greece, hosting Albanian communities, thus fulfilling the irredentist agenda of the Albanians to create a greater Albania. As for the rest of the Balkans, swathes of Greece, the Ionian Islands, the Cyclades and the Sporades, and also of Yugoslavia, Dalmatia, Ljubljana, parts of the Fiume district and of southern France, were to be directly annexed by Italy or attached to the Dodecanese Islands. It remains unclear how the rest of the Italian living space was to be controlled by Italy after the war. A Greek rump state, deprived of parts of its territories to the northwest and of many of its islands, would remain as a semi-autonomous state. Croatia, made independent by the Italians and by the Germans, just as Montenegro, were to be controlled by Italy through a personal union under the King Vittorio Emanuele III. In May 1941, Italian and German representatives met in Vienna to discuss how to reshape the Balkans after the victorious campaign of April 1941. This was a cold shower for the Italian Foreign Ministry. Italy had to accept a number of German decisions, such as the formation of a Greek collaborationist government that conflicted with its plan to establish an Italian civilian commissioner in that country. A demarcation line between the Germans and Italian spheres of interest in the Balkans was drawn. This left key economic resources under German control. Much to Italy's discontent, Bulgaria got large shares of Greek and Yugoslavian territory. Thus, planning for Italy's Lebensraum had to include now many uncontrollable variables. But much of the vagueness of the Italian plans reveals also the limits of Italy's empire building. There were hardly any plans as to how actually integrate Italy's European empire with African possessions. Fascist Mediterranean empire remained pretty much wishful thinking. In this case, what stood in the way of Italy's policy and planning was time. The Italian empire did not last long enough for such plans to be developed or for any actual policies to be implemented. Poor communications, the Mediterranean Sea remained for the most part of the war a dangerous travelway for the Italian Navy, added to this. Plans to Italianize some of the regions under Italian control, in particular those directly annexed, were very audacious. Yet they met with enormous difficulties. Italian communities living in regions to be integrated directly, such as Dalmatia or the Ionian Islands, were too small and scattered. In Dalmatia, for example, Governor Giuseppe Bastianini, far-reaching plans of Italianization met with enormous logistic difficulties. The non-Italians were clearly the majority in the region, and Bastianini was not able to motivate Italians to settle in this region from Italy. Italian authorities were forced to rely much more than planned on assimilation, seeking, at least in the first months and up to September 1941, to stimulate cooperation of local non-Italians. To ensure the working of the administration, Governo Bastianini was even forced to grant to non-ethnic Italians born in Italy, born in Italy's controlled Dalmatia, a form of minor citizenship with limited rights to allow them to work in the Italian bureaucracy. Even more contradictory was the Italian policy in the province of Ljubljana, directly attached to Italy. Another territory that, although this annexation, it was attached to Italy, although the annexation of this territory had not been foreseen prior to the occupation. Here, ethnic Italians were as good as non-existent, and the Italian authorities relied in much greater measure on the collaboration of local political elites. This attempt to raise the collaboration of local forces came to an end during the course of 1941 with the rise of the resistance movement. In the Ionian island, not formally annexed but where the Italian civilian commissioner Pietro Parini was appointed, plans of Italianization were not even devised. Parini expanded in some of his memoranda on the possibility of expelling Jews and the Maltese population from the islands. Yet no concrete plans in this direction was ever developed. No settlement scheme is to be found in the records of the Italian administration of the islands. While direct rule was applied in the annexed region, indirect rule was the norm in most of the Italian occupied territories. The most significant example of indirect rule was that deployed in Albania. After the invasion of April 1939, the country remained formally independent. With the flight of the former ruler, King Zog, the crown was offered by the Albanians to the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, and the country adopted a new constitution, whereby a luogotenente, a lieutenant, representative of the Italian king in the country, was granted wide-reaching powers. The country thus retained a national government and national institution, reshaped along the fascist model, with the creation of an Albanian fascist party, a singularity in Italy's empire building. Behind the facade of independence, Italian envoys had their say in every single affair of internal politics of Albania, and foreign affairs were officially handled by Rome. Most of the remainder regions were controlled with the classic regime of occupation. If compared to the German occupation structures in Europe, Italy's occupation structures were mostly military ones. For lack of resources, the Italians had to rely mostly on military personnel, a peculiarity of the Italian rule that goes back to the colonial administration in Eritrea, Libya, and Ethiopia. Here also, because of the lack of trained civilian personnel, Italian rule had relied heavily on army personnel. The occupation of World War II inherited this tradition of governance. Most territories under Italian control were ruled as classical military occupation. Local governments remained in charge of administering the occupied territory. In some cases, as in Greece, with no significant change of state borders, in the independent state of Croatia and Albania, as mentioned, never national government were appointed by the Italians. However, with the occurrence of major uprisings and the rise of resistance movements in Montenegro, in Croatia, and Slovenia already in 1941, and in Albania and in Greece only in 1942, also territories originally entrusted to civilian personnel were handed over to military authorities. This was, for example, the case of Montenegro, which the Italians wanted to turn into a semi-independent state in personal union with the Kingdom of Italy. However, as soon as July 1941, a massive uprising of the population forced the Italians to create a military government under General Alessandro Pirzobiroli. More than 100,000 soldiers occupied a territories of 15,000 square meters, inhabited by less than 400,000 people. The military government was initially devised as a provisional form of rule to pacify the country, but remained in place until the Italian armistice of 1943. The same happened in the province of Ljubljana, where the resistance organization were started early on in 1941 to attack Italian garrison. In the winter of 1941-42, securing public order was entrusted to the military, which marginalized the Italian High Commissioner. Also in Croatia in 1941-42, the Italian expanded the area of occupation, taking over the administration of territories formerly assigned to the independent state of Croatia. Southern France shows a very similar dynamic. A further reason for transition from civilian to military rule was the fact that most collaborationist governments set up by the Italians revealed themselves too independent from the Italian directives, pursuing their own agendas, be they ethnic, political, economic, or social ones. Also, the regions occupied by the Italians became immediately the site of enormous social and economic crises that in different ways intertwined with the collapse of the existing state structures and the rise of alternative power instances that challenged the territorial control both of the collaborationist forces and of the Italian authorities. Yeah. By choosing to create the independent state of Croatia in 1941 and bring the Ustašas to power, the Italian authorities unleashed a series of dynamics, ethnic conflicts, violence, social and economic disruption that largely escaped and challenged Italian control of. Interestingly, violence was explained by the Italians as rooted in essentialized identities, the primitive savagery of the Slavic people, obliterating the fact that it had been the Italians themselves who had to create the states, actually. Such Balkanist essentializations are to be seen as attempts to make sense of the contradictions within the Italian strategy of indirect rule. Conceived of as a way to govern large territories with a minimum expense of forces, indirect rule reveal highly dysfunctional, as most governments followed agendas divergent from or even contrasting the Italian intentions. This explains why the Italian military adopted a policy that utterly contradicted the initial pro-Croatian attitude, and as early as 1941 allied with the Chetnik Serb guerrillas. Another good example is that of Kosovo, attached to Albania in 1941, where Yugoslavia was dismembered. Here, local Albanians started attacking Serbs and Montenegrin peasants who had been favored by the agrarian reforms of the interwar period in Yugoslavia. This dynamic did not derive from an Italian directive, and the Italian tried to pacify the region by appointing a special commissioner. However, in December 1941, the administration of this region went over to an Albanian ministry based in Tirana, which radicalized the anti-Serb violence. The role of the Italians, which had favored the Albanian element from the very beginning of the occupation of Kosovo, was in some cases that of a sort of bystander to a wave of violence that unfolded following its own logic. On the other hand, armed resistance triggered further social dynamics. Partisan armies created forms of governance in the liberated areas that served two goals. They were a precondition for the very existence of the liberation armies, as without extracting resources and without the logistics offered by the local population, it was impossible for the people armies to survive. But it was not only out of practical considerations, but also because the resistance legitimized itself by giving rise to new forms of political powers, by harnessing to itself social dynamics unleashed by war and occupation. As you can see in the picture of this book, showing this book actually, that I've co-edited with Xavier Bouguerel and Sabine Rutar, control of food resources was a key element in the formation of new power instances and in the attempt of old ones to legitimize themselves. The Italians responded to the loss of control of much of the occupied territory by practicing increasingly indiscriminate violence, reprisal against civilians, internment, destruction of material resources like housing, food, to to starve the partisan movement by subtracting the necessary resources they needed to survive. And I will come now to the conclusion. Italy's fascism had far-reaching plans to reshape the Mediterranean area. These were premised on the idea that classic imperialism, that of the so-called age of empire, had to be outlived. Fascist imperialism, as Daniel Hedinger has aptly said, was a sort of post-colonial imperialism, premised on the idea that fascist mission was to infuse new life into European domination over semi-peripheral or peripheral areas of the world. The Balkans were regarded as one such. Here, fascist mission was to redraw national boundaries to overcome the conflict-ridden Wilsonian order. However, the contradictions between plans and reality are sometimes so strong that one may wonder if we can speak of fascist occupation at all, or should rather speak of occupational societies where the occupation forces just perform their administrative duties according to a very pragmatic logic, devoid of any ideological component. I would say that much of the question mark in this question lies in the meaning we give to the concept of occupation itself. By occupation, we first mean the setting. And we also mean, of course, the act of occupying a country, of invading a country, but also of drawing new borders, of creating new governments in political terms, with annexations or creation of new states or military occupation. But occupation means also the creation of forms of governance on the spot, where different power instances often acted in competition with each other, and sometimes even outside the political framework established by their own government, like the Italian military did, for example, in Croatia in 1941, 1942. Finally, however, I think one could speak of an occupation society, namely the social dynamics often unleashed by the first level, by the occupational setting, but then following their own logic. On this third level, the occupiers are often just one of the parties involved in a very complex dynamics that involves other actors as well, just as powerful as the Italians, for example, the resistance organization or the collaborationist governments or the ethnic groups acting in following and pursuing their own agendas. And all this can only partially grasp by the word occupation, I say, which actually led the German historian Tatjana Tönsmeier, to speak of a Besatzungsgesellschaft, of an occupation society, a word that grasps more, I think, more clearly the situation of an occupation regime, like was that of Italy during the Second World War. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Hvala profesoru Fonciju, a vi ako imate koje pitanje slobodno iznesite, ali na engleskom jeziku ili na talijanskom kako bi profesor mogao da odgovori. Hvala. Si?
Thank you, Paolo, for your very insightful remarks. I was just wondering about one smaller question that you've mentioned. Well, it is a big question, but it is a small question in your presentation, and feel free to just decline an answer if you feel like it's going too far. But I was wondering, in all these scenarios that you've mentioned, the German factor is also something that has to be discussed. And just considering the fact that you've very clearly showed that from Slovenia down to Greece there are similarities in the Italian occupation, and therefore I was wondering if there's also similarities, if the impact of the German occupation just across the border from the Italian occupation regimes played a similar role in every single of these sectors, if cooperation worked better in some of the regions, or if the diktat by the Germans was very clear from the get-go and all over the occupation period up until 1943 in all the regions. Thank you.
Yeah, but do have in mind that we have only 7 minutes left.
Only 7?
Yep.
Okay.
It's a big question, yeah, for a new lecture.
Yeah. Well, so the German factor plays a great role, but I would say the existence of different occupying powers in general, so more generally, also Bulgaria, for example, no? So which was a very interesting relationship actually, because the Italians, as far as I could assess in Greece, for example, saw the Bulgarians rather as enemies than as allies. No? Competition was extremely strong, and so, for example, in some regions where the inhabited by Slavic-speaking minorities, like Kastoria, for example, the Bulgarian envoys were kicked out by the Italians in 1942. So they were allies, but they were actually kicked out. So competition in general with all these actors, I would say, also with the Germans, was so very, very strong, and it acted in, I would say, in different ways in different regions. One good example is the region of Mitrovica, for example, held by the Germans, but where a consistent Albanian population lived, and actually that was used by many Albanians opposing the Italian rule in Albania proper to seek refuge from the Italian authorities. So when they were actually pursuing them. So competition, I would say, allowed in many regions, border regions like Mitrovica or Kastoria, much more, gave much more room for maneuver to the local population, I would say. And actually was conducive to an enormous lack of control by the Italians in those border regions. And I mean, so it is just an example, so I could take other examples. So you, for example, in your book, so you show how the competition between the Germans and the Italians in Slovenia acted. No? So the refugee issue, for example, is very strong in that region. So it acts in different ways in different regions, I would say. So to try to give an answer to a very complex question, but in general, I think competition is much stronger than convergence and cooperation, so between all the allies in the Balkans. And this, I think, is a very important component of the history, a key factor in the history of the Balkan occupation during World War II, because it's a very fragmented territory, both in terms of occupiers, but also in terms of society then. In ethnic terms, but also I would say in economic terms and social ones.
Just Mike.
Thank you much, Dr. Fonzi, for this inspiring lecture. I was wondering, because I was dealing a lot with fascist camps and Slovene memory during the war, if there are any differences in the perception of Italian occupying forces in regard to the race. So Slavic, let's say, not race in this sense as we are thinking about now, but in terms of different, let's say, cultural groups, Slavic, Albanian, Greek. Thank you. Are there any differences in terms of, treatment of these populations, if you maybe came to any conclusions?
Well, actually, I would rather speak, so there were actually racist theories at that time, so developed in, journals like La Difesa della Razza, or even handbooks, so written by racial theories at that time. But I would rather speak actually of ethnic stereotyping and how this interacted with the imperialist imaginary of the Italian and also with the imperialist policies practice in reality, so the actual imperialist policies. And I would say that actually in the racial imagery of the Italians, the Albanians had a very high position, while actually the anti-Slavic stereotype was very, very strong. So it was really a stereotype, so it was constructed over decades in the Italian culture in general. So the idea of constituted a sort of bulwark against the advance of the Slavic world was powerful. And looking at some plans of ethnic remolding of the Balkans, so that are found in the records of the Italian armies or of the Italian foreign ministry, so for example, that were never actually implemented, but so they were actually written down. So they are on paper. So you can say that the anti-Slavic element was the most powerful one. So the idea of actually, so in the plan, so devised in 1941, so for example, so the idea of taking the black population, resettling them, and creating a sort of zone of buffer zone, so between the Italian advance and the Slavic world. So settling black population akin to the Italians actually, so because of speaking a Latin language, and also so considered as heirs of the Roman Empire to some extent. So it was very, so was actually one of the idea put forth by this memorandum. So this was very, very strong. And also the idea of the Albanians as a sort of inferior but superior race in the Balkans, as a sort of the best allies of the Italians, which was so very much propagated in many Italian writing of the war period. But I would say I was struck, for example, so by looking at the letters written by the Italian soldiers stationed in Albania or Greece, they held completely opposite opinions as regards, for example, race hierarchies in the Balkans. So they mostly say the Albanians, so they are really primitive, so they are not really our allies. And the Greeks are much better off, so they are a sort of modern state compared to the Albanians. Yeah? So.
I think that we should quit now. No, we don't have time so we shall thank Professor Fonzi and continue with our next lecture. Thank you.
Sorry for being too long then for the question, so we can talk it.